Hello. For today's episode of Writing Notes, I'm going to talk to you about what I think are the 5 basic principles for successful business writing. Now these are sort of business writing 101 in a way, like if you're going to distill successful business writing down to 5 major principles that you want to keep in mind in order to be successful, these for me are the 5. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of them, and I'll talk a little bit about why it's useful, why it's an important business principle. So, number 1 is to adopt a you-centered attitude, or a reader-centered attitude. So what does this mean? Well, generally speaking, readers, and business readers in particular, are fundamentally selfish. They're primarily concerned with what a message has to do with them. Why is this important for me? What do I have to do? How does this affect me? What kind of changes do I have to make? Things like this. And why should I be motivated to do whatever this message is about? So as a writer, that's the first thing, probably in almost any writing context, that you want to make sure that you're doing, is thinking about who your reader is. And you want to make sure that you're organizing your information, that you're choosing your rhetorical appeals, that you're choosing your evidence, that you're shaping your arguments for your particular reader's values, concerns, needs, interests, etc., etc. So, for instance, let's say you are writing a memo to your employees about a new policy, right? So what do they need for that memo? What do they as readers require? What do you as a reader require? This is the way we want to think about business writing. Some of the things they might require are specific details. So when does this policy go into effect? What exactly is involved? Who's in charge of implementing it? What do they as individual employees need to do? Are there going to be changes to things like the hours that they work, the type of jobs they're required to do, or the type of tasks they're required to do, things like this. We also want to be thinking about what are their potential concerns. So, do we need to assuage concerns that a particular financial restructuring of an organization might lead to layoffs or something like that? Are people likely to be concerned that there's going to be more intrusive oversight into their particular work? So all of these things we want to think about, and this all connects us with understanding and anticipating who the reader is. So that's the first principle. The second principle is to be brief. So a lot of times in academic writing we tend to think longer is better, longer paragraphs, longer papers. If we exceed the page count, we tend to think of that as better than if we are below the page requirement. In business writing, it's the opposite. In business writing, we want to be more concise. We want to be more compact. And part of the reason for this is that business readers generally don't want to read things. And so the quicker you can say something and the less words you can use, the more likely the reader is to actually read the entire thing. So you want to be brief. You want to be concise. The third principle is to be polite. And this is, again, partially about establishing a you-centered attitude, but it's also about establishing goodwill and establishing a connection with the reader. Because generally speaking, in business writing, you're working with others. You want them to do something for you, you want to get them to hire you, you want to get them to accept some policy change, you want to get them to show up for a meeting, whatever it is. So you're working with people, and one of the ways that we convince people, one of the ways we engage with people is by being polite. Now, part of the trick with this, particularly in today's business climate where so much business is done internationally, is you need to figure out what it means to be polite to your audience. Not necessarily what it means to be polite to you as a writer. And so, for instance, in different cultures, we have different, say, levels of formality that a reader might reasonably expect. If you were writing to someone, for instance, in Japanese or a Chinese context, they might expect a greater degree of formality than if you're writing to someone in an American context, in a US context or Canadian context, for instance. On the other hand, I think that if you're writing to someone in, say, a Latin American context, they may often be less formal than we tend to be in the US. There may be more personal discussion. So you want to be aware of what your reader is going to consider polite, and you want to try and meet those expectations. So that's 3. The 4th is to be positive. Because the more positive, the more upbeat you can be, even when you've got bad news or you've got a problem or something like this to convey. If you can be an optimist about it, you're more likely to get the reader on your side. You're more likely to get them thinking optimistically about a problem as well, or about a situation as well. One of the tricks with this is that when you're conveying bad news, you want to make sure that you're not disingenuous. So you want to make sure that you're not presenting bad news as though it's good news, because at that point, if you're misleading your reader or your audience, then you're violating business ethics and basic sort of communication ethics. You don't want to lie. Like I think that's a pretty fundamental rule for successful persuasive writing, is tell the truth. But when you're presenting negative news, there are particular strategies that you may want to use. For instance, you may want to set up a buffer, which is a sort of opening statement that starts either with negative news or with a somewhat positive spin. So, for instance, if you are announcing a round of layoffs, this is bad news. It's very hard to be positive about this, or at least very hard to be positive in a way that readers who are being laid off are likely to find persuasive. So what you can start with to try and soften this blow is something like discussion of the fine work that the employees have done, the fine work that the company has done, something like this. And then say, but here are some of the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in: economic downturn, unexpected profit loss, increased competition, whatever it is. Therefore, we have to let some people go. And so you can, it's not necessarily positive in the sense that it's good news, because it clearly isn't, but it's positive in the sense that it begins with something positive, and then it gently builds to the negative message. So that's a good structure to try and ease negative announcements. And again, in positive announcements, it's much easier to be positive. Even in routine announcements, it's much easier to be positive. But you want to try and do that as much as possible. Always see if you can use your phrasing to emphasize something that's successful rather than emphasizing something negative and then returning to the positive. And then our fifth key principle of business writing, I think this is probably the big one. This one, along with adopting a you-centered attitude, I'd say number 5 is the key here, which is you want to be clear and specific. And this is a crucial thing. So in business writing, you have a responsibility to convey information directly and to convey all of the information that a reader needs. Otherwise, your communication is not going to be successful. So you want to make sure that a reader will know exactly what you want them to do, exactly what information you want them to have, exactly when they need to meet deadlines, what they need to turn in, how they need to do a particular thing. You want to make it absolutely easy for the reader, because again, most business readers don't want to spend a lot of time reading messages. They don't want to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what you're saying. So in this way, it's better to be simple and direct than it is to try and do something clever and really interesting. And so that's something that you want to do in business writing. So there's your 5 key principles, for me at least. Adopt a you-centered attitude. Be brief, be polite, be positive, and be clear and specific. And I think if you take these 5 principles and apply them to almost any business writing situation, or to most other non-business writing situations as well. But if you take these 5 principles and apply them to almost any business writing situation, business communication situation, you're likely to be pretty successful. Thanks for listening.